I never imagined I would be erased from my own mother's legacy while standing 10 feet from her portrait. The conference room at Whitmore and Daniels overlooked Charleston Harbor, sunlight glinting off the water as if the world outside hadn't shifted at all. Inside, every seat was filled. Board members from Carter Shipping sat stiffly along one wall. A pair of reporters lingered near the door, pretending this was routine estate coverage and not the unraveling of a maritime empire. At the head of the polished mahogany table hung a framed photograph of my mother, Margaret Carter, her expression sharp and unsentimental. My stepfather, Gregory Hale, checked his watch before the will was even opened. Olivia, his daughter, leaned back in her tailored navy suit, arms folded, eyes already scanning the room like she was calculating her new authority. I sat opposite them, hands clasped, steady on the surface. Everyone in that room believed I would inherit at least part of Carter Shipping. I was Margaret Carter's only biological child. I had spent my life around docks and drafting tables, learning the bones of coastal structures the way other children learned nursery rhymes. When my name was finally spoken, I lifted my chin. What I received instead was an abandoned lighthouse 3 hours offshore. Gregory did not even try to hide his satisfaction. Attorney Daniel Whitmore cleared his throat and continued reading in a voice too careful to be neutral. To Gregory Hale, the primary beachfront estate valued at $18.5 million. The Maritime Investment Fund totaling approximately $22 million. Full operational control of Carter Shipping. Olivia Hale received 3 commercial ports and 2 resort properties in Key West. A faint ripple moved through the room. No one spoke, but I felt it. The shift, the calculation, the quiet understanding that control had just consolidated in Gregory's hands. And to my daughter, Natalie Carter, Whitmore continued, I leave the property known as Graymore Lighthouse, decommissioned 40 years prior and currently non-operational. Someone near the window whispered, "Condemned." Gregory smiled thinly. "You always did prefer ruins, Natalie." Olivia gave a soft laugh. "At least the seagulls will keep you company." I did not react. I looked directly at Whitmore instead. Was my mother of sound mind when she signed this will? She was, he said without hesitation, 19 days before her passing, fully competent. He hesitated, then added, "She left a handwritten instruction addressed specifically to you." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. Inside was the deed to Graymore Lighthouse, and a single line in my mother's unmistakable block handwriting. "Go to the island." Gregory's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing again. As the meeting dissolved into press questions about restructuring and strategic leadership, I opened the deed folder once more. Tucked behind the formal paperwork was a small slip of paper with handwritten GPS coordinates. They did not match the publicly recorded location of Graymore Lighthouse. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. If the lighthouse was truly worthless, my mother would never have needed to hide where to stand. I chartered a fishing boat before sunrise, telling the harbor master I needed a quiet ride out past the Georgia line. The captain didn't ask many questions at first. He was in his late 60s, sun-creased and steady-handed, the kind of man who had spent more time on water than land. But when I gave him the coordinates for Graymore Island, he glanced at me sideways. "That lighthouse?" he asked. "Thought it was condemned near 40 years now." "That's what I've been told," I said. He grunted as we pulled away from the dock. Charleston's shoreline shrank behind us, the skyline dissolving into haze. After a few minutes he added, almost casually, "Funny thing though, saw a helicopter out that way twice this past month, didn't look like tourists." Graymore was supposed to be worthless property, a liability, a forgotten structure rotting offshore. Helicopters didn't land on worthless islands. The ride took just over 3 hours. The Atlantic was calm, but the farther we went, the more isolated the horizon felt. No commercial traffic, no pleasure boats, just open water and wind. Graymore emerged slowly from the fog, a jagged cluster of rock and stubborn pine trees. The lighthouse stood tall but weather-beaten, its white paint peeling, iron railing streaked with rust. A faded, condemned notice flapped against the main door. Up close, it looked abandoned. But not neglected. The steel hinges on the front door were recently oiled. I could see the dark sheen against the corroded metal. Someone had maintained entry. Near the old radio mast, half hidden behind scrub brush, I spotted a compact satellite dish, far newer than anything installed 4 decades ago. I stepped inside. The air smelled of salt and old stone, but beneath it lingered something else: machine lubricant, clean metal, not pure decay. As an architectural preservation specialist, I assessed the structure instinctively. The granite foundation was intact. No major fractures. No settling that would justify demolition. In fact, I noticed a thin line of marine-grade sealant along the base joints, modern high-strength material designed to withstand extreme wave pressure. Someone had reinforced this place. I moved toward the spiral staircase. Dust layered the steps, but fresh scuff marks cut through it in narrow arcs. Not many, just enough. Up in the lantern room, the glass panes were cracked but intact. The Atlantic wind howled through thin gaps. I circled slowly, studying the floor. One brass panel near the center looked slightly misaligned. I knelt and pried it open. Inside lay a sealed titanium cylinder, no larger than my forearm. It was cool and dry, untouched by moisture. I unscrewed the cap. Blueprints. Not for restoration, for reinforcement. Cross-sections showing structural steel running beneath the visible foundation. Depth markers extending below sea level. And taped to the final sheet, a titanium key engraved with my mother's initials. At the bottom of the blueprint, written in her block handwriting, "If you're reading this, you're ready." I descended to the engine room, matching the diagrams to the actual layout. The generator platform looked original, rusted, and inactive. But beneath one corner, partially hidden by corroded paneling, I found a circular locking port. I slid the titanium key in. It fit perfectly. When I turned it, I expected old gears and grinding resistance. Instead, I heard a controlled hydraulic release. The concrete floor split cleanly down the center, retracting with quiet precision. Beneath it, a vertical steel shaft descended into darkness. An industrial lift platform waited inside, faint blue light glowing from a control panel. The captain's voice drifted faintly from outside. "Everything stable in there?" "Yes," I called back. The lift doors slid open as if they had been expecting me. Graymore Lighthouse was not abandoned. It was waiting. I stepped into the lift and pressed the only illuminated button. The steel doors sealed with a soft pneumatic hiss. Too smooth, too modern for anything labeled condemned. As the platform descended, I counted under my breath. 5 seconds, 10, 15. We were dropping deeper than a simple maintenance cellar. The air changed first. The damp salt smell faded, replaced by cool, filtered dryness. The hum of concealed ventilation grew louder. When the lift finally stopped, the doors opened onto reinforced steel walls lined with recessed lighting. This was no crawl space. A biometric panel glowed beside the entrance. Before I could reach for it, a scanner beam flickered across my hand. Access granted flashed briefly across a small screen. My mother had programmed this for me. I stepped inside. The underground space stretched farther than I expected, reinforced concrete and steel support beams forming a secure maritime data facility beneath a forgotten lighthouse. Server racks lined one wall, their quiet hum steady and controlled. Industrial dehumidifiers pulsed softly, maintaining a climate that protected whatever was hidden here. At the center of the room stood a long stainless steel table. Along the far wall, several heavy vaults were bolted into place, each labeled by year. 4 years' worth of containment. I approached the first vault and entered the override code listed in the blueprint margin. The door unlocked with a clean metallic click. Inside were vacuum-sealed stacks of cash, bundled and cataloged. A ledger lay on top, each transfer recorded in meticulous handwriting. $37 million, moved gradually over 4 years. The dates aligned precisely with the period Gregory began consolidating operational control of Carter shipping. This wasn't panic, it was strategy. I moved to the server console and inserted the digital storage key from the titanium cylinder. The screen flickered to life, revealing encrypted folders labeled with project names that meant nothing at first glance. Inside were maritime contracts routed through offshore subsidiaries, shipping manifests altered after departure, nighttime cargo transfers logged in coded annotations, cross-referenced accounting sheets tied to shell corporations operating out of Nassau and Curaçao. Gregory hadn't just expanded Carter shipping, he had weaponized it. I opened a folder labeled, "For Natalie, Last." My mother appeared on the screen, seated in this very room. She looked thinner than I remembered, but her voice was steady. She explained how Gregory had leveraged rumors about her declining health to push debt-backed expansion deals. If she filed for divorce, a freeze clause embedded in the corporate bylaws would have collapsed Carter shipping instantly, triggering mass layoffs for thousands of employees. So she didn't fight publicly. She isolated him financially instead. She liquidated unencumbered assets and moved them offshore into Graymore, beyond his reach. "What looks like wealth," she said quietly, "is liability." She instructed me to open a specific encrypted folder. Inside was a scanned marriage certificate from Nassau. Gregory Hale married to Vanessa Price 8 years earlier. No divorce decree attached. My pulse quickened. The will had transferred assets to my lawful spouse at the time of my death. If Gregory was still legally married to Vanessa Price, then his marriage to my mother was void from the start. As I processed the implications, the server monitor flickered. A remote login attempt notification flashed across the screen. Originating IP, Carter Shipping Subsidiary Office, Savannah. Someone else was trying to access Graymore in real time. The Lighthouse wasn't just hiding money, it was still connected, and whoever was on the other end knew I had found it. The remote login alert kept blinking on the screen like a silent alarm. I disconnected the external uplink first, isolating Graymore from the mainland network before whoever was probing could gain deeper access. The servers hummed steadily, indifferent to the tension building in my chest. I copied the critical files onto encrypted drives in rapid order: the Bahamas marriage certificate, the altered maritime contracts, the 4-year ledger detailing asset transfers. Just before the connection fully severed, a trace window flashed on the monitor. The originating IP registered to a Carter Shipping Subsidiary Office in Savannah. Gregory wasn't guessing. He knew there was something here. The low thrum of rotor blades cut through the Atlantic wind before I could climb back up the lift. I stepped outside the lighthouse just as his helicopter descended onto the rocky clearing near the shoreline, salt spray whipping across the blades. He stepped out alone. He wore a navy windbreaker and mirrored sunglasses, as if this were a casual inspection instead of a confrontation. He looked at the lighthouse, then at me. "How's the structural assessment going?" he asked smoothly. "Better than expected," I said. "The foundation's remarkably stable." His jaw tightened, barely noticeable, but there. "It's still condemned." "That's not what the stone says." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I've already filed preliminary paperwork, public safety hazard. The county won't allow it to stand much longer." I studied him. "That seems urgent for a worthless property." He shifted strategies without missing a beat. "I'm willing to make this simple. $120,000. Wire transfer within 24 hours. You sign it over and you're free of the liability." "You're generous," I replied, "for something you insist has no value." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't understand the risk you're taking. Investors don't like family drama. Your reputation in architectural preservation circles, it can disappear faster than you think." The threat was subtle, but it was a threat. "I'll take my chances," I said. His composure hardened. "City inspectors will be here within days. Maritime insurers will classify it as uninsurable. This structure won't survive the paperwork." "You seem very certain." He leaned in slightly. "You don't know what you're standing on." I held his gaze. "I know exactly what I'm standing on." For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Not anger, uncertainty. He turned abruptly and walked back toward the helicopter. I noticed Olivia wasn't with him. That meant she was handling something else. Damage control, perhaps. Back in Charleston that evening, a courier delivered official notice to my office. Emergency condemnation hearing scheduled within 72 hours. Petition filed by Gregory Hale in his capacity as acting head of Carter Shipping, citing environmental hazard risk and structural instability. He was accelerating. I contacted a federal maritime law attorney in Savannah before sunset. When I explained what I had found, restricted shipping corridor contracts tied to Graymore, his tone shifted immediately. "If those documents are authentic," he said, "this becomes federal jurisdiction." That was exactly where Gregory would not want this. I stood on the pier at dusk, the outline of Graymore faint against the darkening horizon. He thought he was forcing me into defense, but if this moved into federal waters, he wouldn't just be fighting me anymore. The emergency condemnation hearing was scheduled for 48 hours later, and Gregory had already filed to fast-track demolition. If I wanted to dismantle his authority, I had to move faster. The Bahamas marriage certificate from the Graymore server was powerful, but it wasn't enough on its own. I needed certified confirmation and proof that no divorce had ever been legally recorded. I booked the earliest flight to Nassau under my own name, fully aware that Carter Shipping's internal monitoring systems would flag the reservation. Within an hour of booking, my phone buzzed. Some records were meant to stay offshore. The message came from an unlisted number. By the time I landed in Nassau, I wasn't surprised to see a dark sedan idling outside the airport pickup zone. It didn't follow closely, but it didn't disappear either. At the Registrar General's Department, I filed a formal request for archived marriage records. The clerk retrieved a thick ledger and cross-referenced digital archives. After 30 tense minutes, she returned with a certified copy. Gregory Hale married to Vanessa Price in Nassau 8 years earlier. "No dissolution of marriage on file," she said, tapping the stamp with a pen. "Any declaration of death?" I asked. She checked again. "None recorded here." That alone was enough to fracture Gregory's legal standing. But another detail surfaced when a second clerk quietly mentioned that Vanessa Price had once been listed as a beneficiary in a maritime insurance claim. The claim referenced a cargo vessel accident 5 years ago. The vessel name matched a Carter Shipping subsidiary. I requested maritime incident reports tied to that accident. The file stated mechanical failure in open waters near Freeport. Vanessa Price was listed as missing at sea, presumed dead, yet no formal death certificate had been issued in the Bahamas registry. Presumed was not declared. Legally, the marriage remained intact unless proven otherwise. If Vanessa Price had never been legally divorced or declared deceased, Gregory's marriage to my mother was void from the beginning. Bigamy. As I left the government building, the same dark sedan appeared again at the curb. That evening, when I returned to my hotel, the security latch on my door bore thin scratch marks, as though someone had tested it while I was out. I transferred every scanned document to encrypted cloud storage immediately. Near midnight, my phone vibrated again. Graymore sinks easier than people think. This wasn't just intimidation, it was escalation. The next morning, I met with a Bahamian maritime attorney to confirm jurisdictional consequences. He reviewed the documents carefully, then looked at me over his glasses. Without a divorce decree or legally recognized death certificate, Mr. Hale's second marriage would be invalid under U.S. probate review, he said. I obtained notarized certification, verifying the absence of dissolution records. On the return flight to Georgia, I reviewed my mother's ledger timeline again. The year Vanessa Price disappeared at sea was the same year my mother began transferring assets into Graymore. That wasn't coincidence. When I landed in Savannah, my federal attorney called before I reached baggage claim. "Gregory filed an emergency petition this morning," he said. "He's trying to move demolition forward before the probate hearing." I tightened my grip on the certified documents in my hand. If he wanted speed, I was about to give him something faster. He thought he owned the narrative. But I was about to dismantle the marriage that gave him power in the first place. The demolition inspectors arrived at Graymore just after sunrise. 2 county vehicles rolled across the narrow service dock while a marshal stepped onto the island holding a clipboard thick with stamped papers. Gregory's helicopter was already circling overhead, lowering toward the rocky clearing like this was a routine site inspection instead of a calculated move. "Preliminary structural review," the marshal said. "Emergency order filed." I handed him a copy of the emergency injunction my federal maritime attorney had secured at dawn. National Maritime Security documentation required federal review before any demolition could proceed. Gregory stepped out of the helicopter, composed, almost bored. "This doesn't have to be dramatic, Natalie," he said. "You're obstructing a state administration." "I'm preserving evidence," I replied. The marshal stepped aside to make a call. Within an hour, jurisdiction shifted. Because of the restricted shipping corridor contracts tied to Graymore, the matter was transferred to federal court in Savannah. By noon, we were seated in a federal courtroom. Gregory's legal team framed me as unstable, driven by family drama rather than fact. They argued that as the lawful surviving spouse, Gregory retained authority over estate-related decisions, including the disposal of unsafe property. My attorney stood calmly and requested that the court first establish Gregory's standing as lawful spouse. The Bahamas marriage certificate entered into record, certified documentation verifying no divorce filing, no death certificate for Vanessa Price. Gregory's lead attorney attempted to argue presumed death due to maritime disappearance. My attorney countered with registry confirmation that no legal declaration had ever been filed in any relevant jurisdiction. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, were you legally divorced at the time of your second marriage?" Gregory hesitated. That silence filled the room. My attorney requested that the marriage to my mother be reviewed for validity under bigamy statutes. The word hung heavy in the air. Before Gregory could recover, my attorney introduced sealed documents tied to unauthorized maritime cargo routing discovered beneath Graymore Lighthouse. He requested limited judicial review due to potential national security implications. 2 federal agents entered the courtroom quietly and took seats behind Gregory. Olivia's posture changed instantly. She no longer looked composed. She looked cornered. One of the agents passed a folder to the judge containing preliminary findings regarding altered manifests and offshore shell companies connected to Carter Shipping. The judge ordered temporary suspension of Gregory's authority over the company pending further investigation. Probate distribution to lawful spouse was frozen due to credible bigamy claims. Demolition of Graymore was halted indefinitely. In the hallway afterward, Gregory approached me. "You're destroying everything your mother built," he said through clenched teeth. "No," I answered calmly. "You did that." Federal agents asked Olivia to remain for questioning. Gregory's composure had fractured completely now, his confidence stripped away by procedure and evidence. As I stepped outside the courthouse, Savannah's humid air felt heavier but clearer. My attorney walked beside me. "The judge reconvenes in 48 hours, he said. "That's when the inheritance ruling will be finalized." Gregory thought he controlled the empire. Now he wasn't even certain he controlled his own marriage. And Graymore Lighthouse was no longer a liability. It was evidence. The courtroom was quieter the second time. 48 hours earlier, Gregory had walked in like a man finalizing paperwork. Now he sat rigid at the defense table, shoulders squared but eyes restless, as if searching for exits that no longer existed. The judge began with the issue that had unraveled everything. Certified documentation from the Bahamas was entered into permanent record. No divorce decree, no legally recognized death certificate for Vanessa Price, no evidence that Gregory Hale had dissolved his first marriage before marrying my mother. "The court finds," the judge said evenly, "that the marriage between Mr. Hale and the decedent was void ab initio due to bigamy." The words settled like a stone dropped into still water. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Gregory's attorney rose, requesting a continuance, denied, because the will had transferred assets to my lawful spouse at the time of my death, and because there was no lawful spouse, that portion of the inheritance was invalid. Under Georgia intestacy law, the judge continued, the sole surviving heir was me, Natalie Carter. I did not look at Gregory when the ruling was entered. I stared straight ahead, breathing evenly, letting the weight of it settle. Before the courtroom could empty, federal prosecutors requested the record remain open for a sealed evidentiary submission. Documents recovered from Graymore Lighthouse were introduced, altered maritime contracts, shell company transfers, unauthorized military cargo routing through restricted corridors. The judge reviewed the summary briefly before nodding toward the back of the room. Federal agents approached Gregory. He did not resist, but his composure was gone. The confidence he had worn like armor cracked visibly as he was informed he was under investigation for international trade violations and conspiracy. Olivia stood abruptly, voice tight, requesting private counsel. Within minutes, she was escorted to a separate room to discuss cooperation. Outside the courthouse, news crews were already broadcasting the reversal. Headlines shifted in real time from heiress excluded to bigamy scandal voids maritime tycoon's marriage. Gregory paused once in the hallway, turning toward me. His expression was a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You think you've won?" he said quietly. "I didn't start this," I replied. He was led away. That afternoon, I returned to the Carter beachfront estate for the first time since the will reading. The gates opened slowly, the drive lined with reporters held back by security. Inside, staff gathered in the foyer, faces tense. They expected layoffs, collapse, chaos. Instead, I assured them payroll would continue. An independent forensic audit would begin immediately. Operations would remain intact. Later, in my mother's private study, I found a locked drawer I had never been given access to. Inside was a trust document establishing scholarships for maritime engineering students, funded quietly under my name. She had been building something beyond the noise. The board convened that evening and voted unanimously to confirm me as interim chair pending investigation. The empire Gregory thought he controlled had already shifted beneath him. As night fell, I stepped onto the terrace overlooking the Atlantic. The mansion gleamed under soft exterior lights, immaculate and impressive. But it felt hollow. Graymore Lighthouse had begun as an insult. Now it was the only place that felt honest. I did not move into the beachfront mansion. Advisors insisted it would signal stability. Investors expected photographs of me standing on the terrace, reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Instead, 2 weeks after the ruling, I boarded a small supply boat and returned to Graymore Lighthouse. The island no longer felt hostile. Construction crews I hired were reinforcing the stone exterior carefully, preserving the original character rather than replacing it. The cracked lantern glass had been restored. The rusted railings were treated, not removed. I refused to turn it into a luxury retreat or private estate. I wanted its history intact. Beneath the structure, the underground facility remained operational. I transferred every dollar from the vaults into transparent financial channels, audited and documented. The secrecy had served its purpose. It did not need to define the future. The beachfront estate in Charleston was deeded to a Maritime Academy Foundation within the month. It would fund coastal engineering research and scholarship programs for young students who came from families like the dock workers who once built Carter shipping from nothing. Gregory awaited federal trial. Olivia entered a cooperation agreement and began providing testimony in exchange for reduced charges. I felt no triumph watching the headlines turn against them. Justice had already done its work. Inside the lantern room at Graymore, I replayed the final segment of my mother's video, the portion I had not shared in court. She admitted she knew the will reading would feel like betrayal. She knew I would believe she had chosen Gregory over me. "I left you the lighthouse," she said softly, "because you understand foundations, not appearances." She explained she needed someone who would look past the ruin and see what held it upright, someone who would value integrity over applause. I closed my eyes and let myself grieve her properly, not the business magnate, not the strategist, but my mother. Months later, Graymore Lighthouse reopened as a coastal architectural research and preservation center. When the beacon lit for the first time in 4 decades, the beam cut across the Atlantic like a quiet declaration. I stood alone in the lantern room as night settled over the water. The mansion, the ports, the millions, they were never the true inheritance. Clarity was. Knowing exactly where to stand when the storm came was. If you had been left with nothing but an abandoned lighthouse, would you have walked away? Or would you have climbed down into the dark to see what was hidden? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. I read them, and I love hearing how you would handle moments like this. If stories about family betrayal, hidden power, and justice finding its way resonate with you, stay here with us. There's another story coming soon about a woman who inherited a bankrupt vineyard and uncovered something far more dangerous buried beneath it. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And remember, sometimes the thing they give you to humiliate you is the very thing that saves you. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact,